Hey, well, good morning if you're here on the Pacific West Coast or in the mountains. Good afternoon if you're in the eastern part of North America. Good evening to all of our friends from the UK and Europe and the Middle East. And a late good evening to all the folks tuning in from India and the Philippines. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm here today with Dave Johnson, and we're going to talk about separating the wheat from the chaff. And before I go any further, I'd also like to thank all of the millennials who might be attending, based probably just on wanting to hear Dave Johnson, because you might not know what separating the wheat from the chaff means. My daughter, who just recently graduated from a snooty university, said, "What's that mean, Dad?" And I thought about it and I went, yeah, it's probably as old as the hills. But for those millennials listening, chaff is the unedible in terms of humans part around the wheat germ, normally hay or straw that gets fed to the animals. So the expression is separating the good from the waste or the not so good. And if you sort of Google it, they'll give you the first round of interviews really separates the wheat from the chaff. So that's what we're going to talk about, though. Separating the good from the bad or the good from the not so good. But Dave, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
No, I appreciate it, Larry. Although I got to admit, Larry, I'm a little nervous because for 35, 40 years, I've been asking the questions, and you and many other folks have been on the receiving end. Now, this time, I'm on the receiving end of the questions. So I got to get used to this a little bit.
I've got a friend of mine's a journalist, Dave, and he very much the same thing. He goes, yeah, Larry, I just, I don't like talking about myself.
Yeah.
I'm used to asking questions, and I'm like, well, in this particular case, so you're fairly unique, Dave, in terms of 30 plus years of experience with industrial safety and hygiene news.
Mm-hmm.
Dave and I go back the whole 30 plus years,
Yeah.
going to all the same trade shows and things. And unlike a lot of the other magazine editors that I know, safety magazine editors, you'd be much more likely to see Dave and me, for that matter, not at the trade show, not at the booth, but out at the in the conference area, at the conference sessions, listening to the people, listening to the ideas. Yes, you've got to sell advertising and so on if you're involved in the magazine or the media business. It's how you survive. But not all of them are particularly interested in what they're writing about or whether there's any substance behind it all. So over the years, Dave and I've had many of these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and we know all of the same sort of people. But before we get into all of that, I also want to tell everybody that during some of these conversations, not just Dave and I talking about who's good, who's not, what's good, what's not, and so on. And I even remember telling him once, somebody said, "Hey, Larry, look, I got to keep a roof over my head," So,
right.
there is a bit of that we want to get into at the end, which is, why is there so much chaff out there on the market? Like, and is there something about the system itself that's creating that? And I think that there's stick around for the end, because this isn't just going to be a who's good and a who's not. There's actually, I think, in my opinion, a bit deeper meaning. But Dave, before we get into all of that, could you maybe just tell us how you got in, where you went to school and how you got into the field? Like, how did you, I met you, you were already the editor.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So
Larry, like so many people I've interviewed, safety professionals over the years, I got into safety by accident. A lot of people have gotten into safety by accident, no pun intended.
I know, but
I'm
it's
sure when you were in your acting and modeling days, safety wasn't top of mind with you. It's certainly when I was in journalism school, we studied a lot of news and current events, but I can't say safety was something I was thinking a lot about. I went to Ohio University, a good journalism school, and I came out and I got a job, Larry, my first job working with a small family publishing company in North Philadelphia. They ran 3 magazines. First magazine that I hooked up with was an industrial maintenance magazine. And I
Mhm.
worked on that for about a year and writing about pumps and motors and valves and elevated work platforms just didn't do it for me, Larry. So,
Oh, Dave, no kidding. I mean, we had at the beginning, probably early 80s, we had like hundreds and hundreds of hours of skilled trade training videos, right? And I used to say Raiders of the Lost Centrifugal Pump, 4 hours. You can't miss it, you guys, really. But
so
yeah, I mean, it was pretty dry stuff.
yeah. So, being a small company, we were able to transfer around to the different magazines. Second magazine I worked for was read by owners of industrial supply houses. Now, this was way before Granger took over the industrial distribution world,
Right,
and
right.
these readers were owners mostly of family small businesses, and I enjoyed interviewing the owners. I enjoyed the stories about how they created their businesses, how they grew their businesses. But after about, I don't know, maybe 2 years, Larry, it struck me the kind of writing I'm doing is uh, really all about trying to help these people make more profit, make more money, more profitable businesses. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I thought to myself, this really isn't the kind of writing that I went to journalism school for, to help people make more money. So the third magazine in this little company was called Safety Supply News back then. And this was my introduction to safety. And pretty immediately, Larry, the idea that I would be writing stories and interviewing people that had the potential to save people from being injured or, worst case, killed on the job. This was kind of a mission that I liked. And, people in safety like to say that they're on the side of the angels. And I kind of felt, yeah, this puts me as a journalist in the position of making a positive difference, hopefully. So never look back. Thank you, Satchel Paige. I've been with safety ever since.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I didn't obviously, start off with any particular interest in the field, but I went to a dinner meeting and I had to leave just to use the men's room, and when I came back, they decided I should be the stop guy for Canada. So
Okay.
the moral of this story is don't leave the meeting when they might be picking who's going to get the job. But it somehow seems to get its hooks into you. And I've talked
Oh,
to lots of other people who, like you said, I mean, no pun intended, did not have a direct career path planned
right.
to get into this field, and yet have become some of the most prominent figures in the field. Some of them did literally get into it by accident, like Gary Higby, one of his best friends dying at the plant, and that being a monumental sort of shift in his thinking about what's really important and what isn't, and what do I really want to do. And it may be that just helping shareholders that you'll never meet make more money
Mhm.
isn't quite enough, that you want to do something a bit more. But like I said, Dave, you've always, I've always, like, I could always talk to you, and you were always concerned, and you always were sort of interested in the quality of what was being put forth to all of the people. I should have mentioned, everybody, Dave's also the editor of my second book, Defenseless Moments. Right. And I had it right out there so I wouldn't forget when I was introducing him. But anyhow, better late than never. Probably you are better at the interviewing stuff for sure than I am, Dave. Anyhow, so from there you started working with that magazine. Then what
happened? I just found I learned that safety, for lack of a better term, Larry, is multidimensional. And I could write about injury and accident prevention. I could write about OSHA and OSHA standards and the politics that went on in Washington between business groups that opposed OSHA and union groups that were very supportive. So it allowed me to get into a bit of the Washington political scene. It allowed me to get into organizational dynamics. As you very well know, probably no two companies will run the same kind of safety program. And it really depends on their leadership, on their CEO, on how they're structured, their supervisors, how they treat their people, the culture. These were all things that I never really thought about organizational culture until I started writing about safety. I didn't really think about organizational leadership. Again, I'm a trained journalist. I'm not a business major, but these stories came at me, and then there were also some current events that became very interesting to report on. You had the Bhopal disaster in the 1980s. You had what we called the Asbestos Fever of the early 1990s, where everybody was ripping asbestos out of schools and buildings, and there was a panic about asbestos. And then you got into the 21st century and globalization, and companies started outsourcing their manufacturing, of course, to third world countries. And you had stories about how exploited workers were in some of these developing nations, where now they were manufacturing workers, but they didn't have the benefits of a federal OSHA type of regulatory agency or any kind of inspection force. And so that was another interesting story. And
I remember the first time I saw bamboo scaffolding, thinking,
yep, I was in China the first
time. Might be a while before Safe Start catches on here. Let's see if we could get some insulated work boots on that guy who's using the electric drill before we start talking too much about, the mental lapses and mind not on task. I think you really got to step back at some of these places, Dave, and sort of look at what they're dealing with now, and help them where they are now. But it's certainly eye-opening for sure. Yeah. So you got kind of hooked into all of this.
Like you say, it gets in your blood, Larry. You get hooked. If you, I don't know. I think if you're curious about people, and most journalists by nature are going to be curious, and we all like as journalists, like talking, like listening to people. And I found safety people to be just caring people. They weren't your typical higher level business execs that were all about the numbers and shareholder value. They were down to earth. They were very easy to talk to. They wanted to help their peers. They wanted to use the magazine and articles that I would write and interviews that I would do with them to get their stories and some of their lessons learned and best practices out to the field, to their peers. And so I liked the community. I felt that there was a community of professionals. You mentioned Gary Higbee. I remember meeting Gary, going out to dinner with Gary when he was working in Michigan. This had to be 25 years ago. And as you know, Gary's a great family man. He's got a big family, and we, had a great dinner. Very friendly and very open about kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly that he had seen in safety over the years. And I found that honesty, not just with Gary Higbee, but with many people that I interviewed with. And as a journalist,
if it was 25 years ago in Michigan, I think I know who he was working with back then, and it was pretty ugly, as I recall. Well, he pulled me in to help him with one of the places. It was a location they had in Canada, fairly sizable, like 900, 1,100 people or something like that.
Fairly big job, yeah.
Fairly big place. And I remember after being there and sort of the first meeting, saying to Gary, I said, Gary, you'd need 3 full-time genies and all 9 wishes to fix this place. Like, I'm just apprentice genie. I got one trick, like I'm not so sure this is all going to work here.
Yeah.
It takes more. It takes, all of those things that you were talking about, Dave, I think is also what got me intrigued. But, if you go, I mean, not that, all of those listening here, I'm sure you've already learned not to say, you're an industrial safety expert at a cocktail party and expect that anybody's going to want to talk to you for very long.
Yeah.
Because the perception, I've had so many people say, you mean like safety glasses and hard hats and work boots, like,
Well, even on top of that, Larry, say you're an industrial hygienist and see how people react.
Well, gosh, especially now with COVID, right? I mean, that would be, but it's, but that perception that it is so banal, get like that. And yet, if you were to peruse a safety trade show, it would be hard to come away with the impression that it was anything more than gloves and boots and flame retardant clothing and fall arrest harnesses and safety glasses and hard hats and so on, because so much of the trade show floor is that. But very little of that is what's going on up on the conference level.
Right.
Where, like you said, people are having to discuss new standards and how to deal or cope with the new standards. There'll also be new ideas as well too that are being purveyed. So over the years, see if you can fill in the gaps. I mean, when I started, I remember multi-elemented safety management systems that could be audited coming in from sort of Frank Bird and the International Loss Control Institute. Yep. And then Dan Peterson sort of proving that the audit scores didn't correlate to injury reductions, but perception surveys, which was kind of what he was touting, did correlate to injury reductions. Throughout all of this, there have been a myriad of attempts at bolstering the first line supervisor's competence and coaching skills, et cetera, et cetera. And because that's where the rubber meets the road, I think there's sort of always been attempts being made at that. I mean, Gary, I remember once Safe Start was well on its way, 8-9 years into the market, and we're walking down the aisle at the National Safety Council, and Gary says to me, Larry, we've got to have something for first line supervisors. You and I both know that they're the key.
Yeah.
And I said, Gary, if we walk around the next aisle, I can show you the tombstones of some of the supervisory training programs that are dead and gone. Some of them I was the editor for, some of them I wrote a fair, so I said, don't go venturing up to the top of Mount Everest with, faint heart, because like lots of people have tried and failed at that. But then I think, behavior-based safety, Thomas Krause and Scott Geller hit the scene, and it BBS became just a
Well,
huge wave. Ergonomics was sort of a wave before that, maybe, or during that time. And then it seems lately there's just been a myriad of things that have sort of come up. There's obviously human factors. Safe Start stuff
right.
was around for about 10 years, but then it was like HOP, Safety Differently, Safety 2.0, Industry
Mhm.
4.0. It just seems like there's been a whole bunch of things hitting lately. So, first of all, did I miss any in there? Do you
Well,
remember any of the
here's
biggies?
how I've observed what you've just described over the decades. First National Safety Congress I went to, Larry, to show you how I'm the last of the Mohicans, I guess. It was in the basement of the Conrad Hilton Hotel in Chicago. It was not in a convention center.
Oh my
It was in the
goodness.
basement of the Conrad Hilton on multiple levels, and you took stairs up and down, and there were vendor booths behind pillars, and it
Yeah.
was, they put carpeting down in the basement. And at that time, yes, most of the booths were all about personal protective equipment. That's what was on the attendees' minds. That's what was on safety people's minds. It was much more hardware back then, Larry. Whether it was PPE or back then it was called the American Society of Safety Engineers, and engineering was considered to be a mainstay of safety management. And the first couple of years that I went to conferences, what I did not hear a lot about, I heard a lot about OSHA standards and the need to comply with OSHA standards. And I heard a lot about, again, hardware, machine guards, ventilation systems, lighting systems. But I didn't hear a lot about people. And you talk about, you mentioned some names that I think are responsible for really broadening the focus, I guess you could say, of safety beyond engineering, beyond work conditions, beyond equipment, and getting into the people factor, the human factor. Dan Peterson certainly wrote books about this back in the 70s. And then you had the behaviorists like Tom Kraus and Scott Geller and others in the 80s, started focusing. I found it interesting because when you focus on the people aspects of safety, whether it's behavioral safety or Dan Peterson's perception surveys or accountability systems, you're not talking about OSHA anymore at all. OSHA doesn't, really have any standards relating to how workers are to, behave on the job, so to speak. In the most general sense, OSHA has a lot of standards about what you're supposed to do to enter a confined space or lock out, tag out. And another thing that I observed back in the earlier days, after OSHA came out in 1970, I think it was in part due to the OSHA standards, and I observed that a number of safety programs were kind of like collections of islands, unconnected islands, Larry. You would have a company would have a confined space safety program. It would have a lockout tagout program. Maybe it had a hazard communication program. It had a training program. It had an auditing program. But I call these islands because they were separate programs designed basically to be in compliance with OSHA in most cases, and they were not holistic. They were not integrated, and that integration came much later, really decades later. And I think in part it came about when the focus broadened and turned more to what workers are doing on the job, how supervisors are managing safety on the job. And again, OSHA had very little to say about this. So the safety field needed to kind of pivot away from being all about policing and compliance to more broadly thinking about, why do people act the way they do? Why do people have the attitudes that they do? Why do they take shortcuts? Why may they put themselves in the line of fire? Why are they rushing? Why may they be overconfident or complacent? And again, OSHA has nothing to say about this, but these issues, certainly you brought
Yeah,
them.
can you imagine? Can you imagine the OSHA inspector coming into your workforce saying, "Listen, you got a lot of old, experienced workers here. Show me your complacency program."
Right. Show
And
me your
yet,
fatigue program.
that's if you look at the fatals, that is who's dying. I
Yeah.
mean, like at an alarming rate, people over 58 years old. The number of reports that start out with 48-year-old, 58-year-old journeyman electrician, 62-year-old journeyman carpenter. I mean, it's just it's sad actually, but it's certainly like when you look at these guys, you're going, it isn't a competence issue. That's for sure. It's complacency, and yet, OSHA wouldn't even begin to. We're not even thinking about beginning to think about that.
No.
Which means it's likely never coming, and yet the data's there, unfortunately, right in your face all the time. So we go from all of you started seeing things at least migrate from the basic hardware and the basic compliance and the engineering side of it. As you started seeing all these different things come on, Dave, what appealed to you, what didn't appeal to you, and maybe take us
What
through
appealed to me,
what you think about
yeah,
today.
I, I can answer that question pretty readily, Larry. What appealed to me was the psychology of safety. I never really thought about the psychological aspects of safety and what's going on between people's ears and how much that has to do with serious injuries and fatalities, near misses, all sorts of incidences. And there were a number of consultants came on the scene in the 80s and in the 90s. Not only behavioral scientists, but different kinds of organizational psychologists. I would call them, and I found their workshops at conferences to be refreshing, because again, it was not about compliance. It was not about rules and regulations and discipline and OSHA. It was about, wow, why do people think the way they do? Why do people act the way they do? It really got into human nature issues. And I just found that fascinating. It was the whole psychology headspace part of safety was something new to me that I think I saw really grow in the 80s and 90s. And the other thing, Larry, there were.
I also thought Scott did a lot about bringing the psychology, the research to safety. I went to one of his session in Blacksburg, Virginia, where he teaches, and it was a 2-day session, and we were in the gym working out that night. Not much of a gym there, but that's sort of beside the point. And in all of his stuff, I was just saying, it's all aimed at deliberate risk, though, Scott. Like people making decisions. And he said, "Well, yeah." And I said, "Well, Scott, nobody's ever decided to get hurt, though.
Yeah.
So that's part of it, but it isn't all of it, So I sort of I set out to try to find that other piece, and I'd been kind of working on it at that stage. But I found, like you did, the the psychology behind it all fascinating, because nobody is ever trying to get seriously
And
hurt.
the other point that I would make, Larry, is psychology textbooks can be pretty darn boring. Psychology lectures can be pretty boring. I think one of the things that lifted the psychology of safety and really interested many safety pros was the fact that a lot of the speakers at conferences, such as you, such as Scott Geller, such as Jim Spagner, um, uh, I'm not blowing smoke at you, Larry, but the charismatic speakers, good speakers. I can remember Scott Geller playing the drums at one of his talks.
Well, Dave, I remember going to the sessions that, before I was speaking at it. Remember thinking, well, the bar's not that high here, Larry. Like if you don't read slides to people, you're probably
Right.
be a hit. Thankfully, things have improved a lot since then. But you're right, things were pretty dreary. And I think the other thing was that learning psychology for the sake of learning psychology isn't the same as learning psychology with the aim of applying it to prevent injuries.
Right.
I mean, now you've got something worthwhile to do to apply this stuff versus parenthood and bringing up better children and stuff, which I'm not downplaying that at all. But
That's a very good point. It's got to be
a little more. It was a little more tangible. In other words, and I can, why this part of what I ended up trying to figure out was that, I hear this from folks all the time, like, but he was a good guy, Larry. Like, he's been on the safety committee here and there, positive, good attitude. I mean, I can't believe this just happened.
Yeah.
And obviously you hear about a worker with a bad attitude and so on getting hurt. It all seems to fit, but there was precious few of that compared to the other that I'd be hearing, right? I also remember when I was trying to sell safety videos on hand safety and eye safety and stuff, and I went out to the oil patch, and the field safety officer just looked at me and he said, well, it's a good video, Larry, but he said, we don't really have a training issue here. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, yeah, the young guys get hurt more than the old guys, but it's the old guys who die.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, why would that be? They know how to do the job well enough to teach somebody else, right? Mm-hmm. So, obviously training wasn't going to fix everything either, even though that's all I had to sell at the time. So Dave, take us to about where we are now on the market in terms of what have you seen out there? Certainly there's been a lot more lately come out.
Right.
For those of you in the audience that didn't read Dave's article, I think it was called Safety Differently. Yeah. And it was published ISHN 2019. Excellent article. He interviewed me and for this, and he told me who else he was interviewing for the article. But while we were having the phone call about this interview, this is where we got this getting to the last part of this show, which is why is there so much stuff out there on the market now? And unfortunately, why is there not enough wheat and a little too much chaff? And but if you can, Dave, give us a bit of a rundown on what's out there now, what you think of it, and so on.
Okay. I'd back up a little bit, Larry, and say two things that I've seen over the decades, changes. And one of them is occurring right now, which is the demographic change in who safety professionals are. More women are coming into the field. Baby boomers are retiring. You have, when our magazine has done readership studies, we see a lot of safety pros now 45 years of age or younger. And this has made a change in the products that are being in demand that safety pros are asking for, because the baby boomers who came up in the age of OSHA were mostly looking for compliance products. The professionals who have come into the field since the year 2000, I'll just give you one example, are much more interested in technology. Well, technology certainly has come so far in the last 20 years. But I think the younger generation of safety professionals, as you know, with your kids or my kids, Larry, they grew up with technology in their hands, in their ears. They're very accepting of it, and they almost expect now for technology tools to be part of their safety toolkit, their safety arsenal, if you will. And this has dramatically changed how safety is practiced now with being able to videotape near misses, incidents, hazardous conditions in real time, and either communicate them to the safety office or send out alerts to other workers, either with cell phones, wearables, tablets. Safety has become much more instant communication, much more real time. And the data that is collected through this technology has allowed professionals to be much more analytical about how they look at patterns and how they look at when incidents occur, what time of the day, what day of the week, is it particular locations within a plan. So this has really hit home definitely in the last 20 years. And I would say in particular, if you're walking the floor of trade shows, you would see it in the last 5 to 10 years, the number of technology vendors, either with software or with mobile apps or with handheld devices or with wearables. That's one of the biggest changes that I've seen. The takeover of safety. Right.
As you know, we're investing heavily in all of that. There's a number of things, right? You can prompt a willing choice, right? You say you want to drink more water. Well, if you wait till you're thirsty, you're not going to get any better than you are now, right? And if you say you want to work on moving your eyes first before your hands, feet, body, or car, if you wait until you bump into somebody or something, you're not likely doing that at a different rate than you are now. So you're not likely going to get any better than you are now. But every now and again, you can get a push notification that says, remember to move your eyes first, or remember to drink more water. You get that prompt, right? And, you get to control when the prompts come, how many you get. So, it's all voluntary, but it's a lot better than, having to tie a string on your finger. And then everybody who sees it, you have to explain, I'm trying to drink more water. So,
right.
I think there's some real benefits to it, not to mention just that, and this sort of is a nice segue into where we're going at the end of this, the support side. But, in order to have effective training, especially if it's behavioral training, if you're going to do it in a classroom, you've either got to have a good instructor, you got to have good materials, right? Good singer, a good band, good song, whatever you want. And the presenter guy, if it's a professional coming from the outside, isn't likely going to want to do 20 minutes.
Right.
Well, they might do 20 minutes, but they're going to charge you for a whole day. Yeah. And you may not want to pay $8,000 or $3,000 for 20 minutes. But 20 minutes is about all somebody can absorb, right? So, if you could give them what they needed in sort of 10, 20-minute hunks, then you could make it convenient. That's also easier on the learner. But now you don't have to deal so much with the supply side economics of the good trainer. You could actually get the guru guy himself, like Steph Curry, to come on your master class to teach you how to shoot jump shots.
Right.
And if you don't think he knows, I don't know who you think does. But anyhow, that you can sort of, you could get Jim Spigner or me or whoever it is on that camera talking about it and hopefully make up for what you lose by it not being live. But that's sort of in terms of what you've seen out there lately, Dave. And I'm not trying to get you to, be the judge and jury or the executioner on any of these offerings that are out there.
Right.
But tell us maybe a bit about what you've seen lately that you've liked. You don't necessarily have to talk about anything that you don't like, but I know you've seen it all.
Yeah. I like how safety programs are more holistic now, and there's products out there, safety management systems, software that really integrate all the different parts of safety we were talking about earlier, whether it's OSHA issues, whether it's work conditions, whether it's behaviors and attitudes and psychological aspects, human factors aspects. I like the fact that safety and health management systems have definitely grown in popularity, and I think part of the reason that we've seen more, I would say, human factors, human performance oriented products come on the market, whether they're consulting or whether they're software programs. One thing to keep in mind, Larry, is OSHA has really been pretty quiet in terms of standard setting. When it first came out of the gate, it was a standard setting monster almost, at least in the eyes of a lot of business people. And that only lasted for the first 10 or 15 years. And certainly in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been very, very few major OSHA standards. And so that's kind of created, has opened up the space for human factors, for you look at all different kinds of, I would just say, human nature related products. You can call it human performance, you can call it human factors, you can call it error reduction, you can call it safety differently, or safety 2.0, or the so-called new view of safety. All of these names and these programs and philosophies, really, or schools of thought, really show how far safety has pivoted away from compliance and policing and inspections and writing people up and sticking to the rule book and having a big fat rule book. And now it's much more about what you're all about, really, Larry, and what you've been about for decades. States of mind and why are people doing what they're doing, and how this leads to different kinds of errors. And so I think a lot of these products have come onto the market thanks to the absence of a lot of OSHA activity. And I also think again,
let me just
well,
comma, not a period, but that well, first of all, there was as OSHA came out with new standards, takes companies a little bit of time to catch up. There was a period for sure there in the 80s where there was a standard every year, and if you had new videotapes, eventually CDs, whatever, you could make a business just selling training on those standards. And then that all dried up, and eventually the companies kind of caught up with compliance, but realized also they were still having injuries. Some of the injuries were serious, and they'd still having fatals too, right? So they started, I call them all the beyond compliance initiatives, Dave. Anything that could be from leadership, top down, bottom up, safe start, whatever, all of that and in between. So I think part of it is that the appetite or the revenue potential in that market now increased. In other words, there's more people looking for beyond compliance initiatives than there were when they were struggling just to hit compliance, right? So that demand might be also part of you've also got to have the willingness to supply, right? In other words, are you willing to enter into this market as a supplier, as a provider, purveyor of knowledge and technology, all the rest of that stuff? And obviously, if there's no money in it, you're not going to be too keen, right? So
Right.
that's part of the draw. But the other part that you and I talked about was that and I don't really want to start with, I don't know who's the chicken and who's the egg here. And I can't remember if you had an opinion on this as well. But if you say, for instance, do a talk at a major national conference, one I did was called Complacency, the Silent Killer. It was standing room only with people kind of doing the sideways thing at the fire exit at the back, so
Right.
that they could, they couldn't let any more people in, but they could still hear. And,
Of
so
course,
the
this is
conference is
before
out.
COVID and social distancing, right, Larry?
Well, there was none of it back then at
You
all,
can't
but
get those crowds now.
no kidding. But then the conference would ask you to, to speak again next year.
Yeah.
And you'd say, well, do you want me to do the same talk? Because like we had people turned away and they go, no, we need you to do something different. And, certainly, you'd never want to publish the same article twice in a magazine. I think that makes perfect sense to everybody.
Right.
I wouldn't want to be trying to sell that to a magazine publisher, let alone owner. I wouldn't even try to sell it to an editor. As the editor's going, hey, there's no way I can do. So you get forced almost to produce something new.
Well, you made the point, Larry. There's a lot of consultants in safety, and the rise of the consultants also dovetails with the decline in OSHA standards and OSHA enforcement. And one way of looking at it, I think the barriers, maybe why we're talking about the amount of wheat and chaff on the market now. I think the barriers of entry are lower. Back when safety was about engineering, you had to manufacture products to bring them onto the market. Now, if you're about people and you're about psychology, you just need a consultancy, and maybe you need a training program, and maybe you need workbooks, but you're not a manufacturer. And so I think the barriers of entry have become easier for people to come in and consult on safety, give advice on safety, whatever.
You don't need as much behind you anymore for a podcast mic and a PowerPoint deck, and you can start you can start blasting away. How successful you'll be is questionable, obviously, but you're right. It doesn't, you don't necessarily have to have so much of a production or the back office sort of behind you just to sort of put your thoughts out to the market now. That's for sure. I mean, it used to be a little more difficult, but even still, there's it's a bit like the news, like I was saying, like if we don't like the news, but when they put good stories up there about people doing good things, not as many people watch as if they show us stuff where buildings are burning down or people are getting stabbed and there's lots of blood, unfortunately. So we end up watching bad news, but it's partially our own fault because that's what we want, right? So and I think part of the allure of being a magazine or a conference is to be purveying new ideas, because people want to go there and hear the new ideas.
Yeah.
But if you think about it at all, you can realize that there becomes kind of a seamy underbelly to the whole thing as well too, right? Where now you're demanding that every one of these thought leaders comes up with something new next year.
Yeah.
You've got 100+ sessions at some of these national conferences. And they tend to have, at least 50+% of the speakers, the same people back every year. So, over just make the math easy, you got so that's 100 sessions over 2 years. What do you think the statistical chances are that some of them aren't going to have a new front cover and a new back cover and it's going to be the same stuff? I mean, it's going to be an attempt to look new, but there wouldn't be anything new. And then if you had anything new, you've only been a year since the last time you talked. So
Right.
at best, you've got a year of data at best, which when you're talking about things like safety cultures, I've asked a lot of people, Dave, how long for, sustained safety culture. Nobody's ever said 12 months.
Right.
So, there's going to be potentially some not so bona fide, or I don't want to say there'd be maliciously disingenuous material. I don't think anybody would be falsifying things. Like most of the people in this business, like you say, are good people. They're not. They'd be happier finding the cure for injuries than they would finding $1 million, right? Not that there's anything wrong with a successful business. I mean, it's hard to get your stuff to the world without it, but nevertheless, I find most of them are actually in it for the cause more than the mercenary component, right?
I would also say, Larry, that a lot of what we see on the market today in terms of products, yes, they have new names. I was at the ASSP conference this year in Austin, Texas, and you talk about coming up with a new package or a new buzzword to make it to differentiate yourself from what you were talking about a year ago. Number of workshops on mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is a buzzword. I sat in on one of the sessions, but if you think about it, mindfulness is really about awareness. And people have talked about safety, the need for safety awareness and paying attention for decades. And it reminds me of something that a safety pro told me years ago, which is, Dave, there's really not a lot new under the safety sun. It's given new packages, it's given new names, new buzzwords. But again, things like human performance, human factors. I mean, I was doing a little homework, Larry. They go back, you can go back to World War II, and aviation was studying human factors. Healthcare was studying human factors in the 1950s and the 1960s. The nuclear industry was studying human performance. Dan Peterson was talking about the need for supervisor accountability and the need for engagement and the need to really tap the ideas of the people who know the jobs best, the frontline workers. So it just strikes me that a lot of what I see on the market in 2022, have trendy names maybe, and new names, new packaging. But the principles, the ideas behind them, I would say in a lot of cases are not new. I've heard the same thing. People have told me about safety differently, or safety 2.0, or safety version 2.0. If you really look at it, some people will tell me, some safety pros and some consultants say, Dave, they call it safety differently, but when I really study it, I don't see a lot different. I don't see a lot new there. It's some of the same ideas. Yeah, you have pre-job briefings, you have safety huddles, you have different kinds of performance exercises maybe, but it's not really new. But it's a new book, Safety Differently. It's a new title. And it's almost important, as you mentioned, Larry, that products do come off as being different every year or every other year to get the interest, to get the demand. One
Well,
other,
if you, Dave, if you go, I mean, if you just go a little bit out of the safety world, when we've seen it, certainly, American Society for Safety Professionals is pretty consistent about having non-safety topic keynote speakers
right?
come into their annual PDCs. One of the past presidents said, "Hey, Larry, it's for some people, it's 5 days of safety. For almost everybody here, it's 3 full days of safety. So we want to give them some other thoughts, some other things to think about or to listen to, in addition to more safety." Because I was sort of saying that this one guy that I introduced there didn't have anything, didn't say one thing to, like, he tried a bit to tie his talk into safety, but
Yeah,
it didn't lend itself well.
yeah, I've
So
seen those.
he didn't make too much of probably best he didn't make too much of an attempt either, right? And he was a futurist. He didn't know anything about safety,
Yeah,
so he didn't really know how to tie it together and everything. I was commenting about it. They do. If you look at those guys, their job is to be with speaker bureaus and to go from place to place and do the same talk and try to sign as many books after the talk as they can. Normally, they get about 50-50 revenue from the speaking and the books. Every now and again, you hit it right, the ball out of the park, and your book becomes a bestseller, and the revenue from the book exceeds the speaking. But invariably, in 4 to 5 years, you've got to have a new book and you've got to have a new talk and you've got to reinvent yourself.
mhm.
And we know that that's their world. How much different is it if you take it over to being the keynote speakers in the safety world and so on, and you realize that it's not exactly the same,
Mhm.
but it's not that much different either, right?
Well,
Now,
I, there's a point to be made with what you're saying, Larry. When it comes, you had me thinking about this when you said, let's talk about separating the wheat from the chaff. And I think part of the responsibility to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of the safety products, safety improvement products that are on the market is really the responsibility of the buyer. And I think, uh, unfortunately, what has happened with safety staffs being cut back, safety responsibilities being added on to, certainly COVID has added a lot of health responsibilities that weren't there before.
right.
I think a number of safety pros are just hard pressed to really do due diligence and do homework about the products that are on the market. How long has the company been around that is offering this product? What kind of data do they have? What kind of references can they give you? And I think due
Well,
to the
Dave, if I
time
could
pressures, a lot of
just
pros are just kind of passively sitting and saying, okay, show me what you got, and I'll choose from a couple of different alternatives based on what you're presenting me, but they're not really digging deep into what the products are.
Dave, you made another point when we were talking, and I don't know if you remember it, but I did for sure, and that is that they're so bummed. Like, first of all, you're busy, then you've got all this extra COVID stuff, and you can say whatever you want, but it was extra for everybody pretty
Mhm.
much. Okay, um, so you're working 28 hours a day already, and now you got COVID, so you're working 36 hours a day, 8 days a week, 9 days a week. I mean, I'm obviously trying to be a bit funny about it all, but it was overbearing. But you've got all of this now. It seems like even more new stuff coming in at you. And as you mentioned, it can be coming in from so many different places now because there's not so many barriers to entry. So it
Right.
seems like there's a lot more players to keep up
Yeah.
with now too, a lot more ideas. And that, I think, starts to set up, or the way you said it, was, you know, the expectation that they will come and show me your stuff,
Yeah.
your codes. instead of let me show you the cards that I've figured out by being out at the front line. Like
Right.
I remember, not to mention Gary again, but when I first showed Gary the state terror risk pattern, he's like, oh my God, I had this and I had this, but I didn't have this piece here, Larry. I didn't have the 3 sources of unexpected.
Yeah.
And he'll tell you right to this day, if he had that piece, he could have had Safe Start figured out before I did. I think he only had eyes, mind, rushing, and fatigue. But nevertheless, he had in other words, he's out there at the front lines looking like people are still getting hurt. People are still getting killed. We obviously haven't figured it all out because nobody ever wants to. So I'm out there trying to figure out why this is happening. And then you're looking at the other people who are at the front lines, and you're going to get a much different perspective than if you're sitting back going, okay, show me what you got. And now everything is in criticism, analytic mode versus you're out there on a creative front going, well, wait a minute, why? And I think that's why the psychology was appealing to you and me. It was starting to provide a bit of the why underneath all of this,
Exactly.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's sort of going away now to I'll be the movie critic instead of the guy out there making the movie. Because if you're the guy out there making the movie and you watch somebody else's movie,
right,
it's a lot different than if you've
different.
never made a movie before, let me tell you, right? So it's even a lot different than if you're actually just an actor with a small part on the set, which is typically all I ever got, Dave. But
You didn't know about that.
Yeah, well, no. So I remember when we were talking about this, you were saying that, is it well, I'll ask you, I'll just ask you, I'll be the journalist. Do you think it's a lack of curiosity? Do you think it's lazy? I think would be too strong.
I got to be honest. No, I got to be honest, Larry. I think there is a degree of laziness. And I go back to thinking about, in my mind, there's 2 kinds of buyers for safety products. Training programs, improvement programs, performance programs. I'm overgeneralizing, but I think there's 2 basic types of buyers. The one buyer is the person who's had a serious injury or fatality in the workplace, and they've been born again. Senior leadership never wants to make that phone call to a family again, never wants to go to a funeral again. They've been born again about safety, but I don't think they go deeply into safety in terms of their, again, due diligence, their research about products that are out there. They just know they need something. They have a knee-jerk reaction to this terrible tragedy, and they rush out to find a fix. The other kind of buyer to me is a CEO, say, who just has a personal interest, a value system that cares about people, who truly wants his people to go home in one piece and come back the next day, even extends off the job to their families. And I think that kind of buyer is maybe going to be, since they have a different reason, different motivation for being interested in safety, they may scrutinize safety products a little bit more seriously. But I think too many times there's knee-jerk reactions to safety incidents that happen, and it's like, we got to fix this, and we need something fast. I got to do something. And,
do you think there's a bit of almost like the fashion world? Like I want my company to be doing the latest, greatest, trendiest thing. So, we want to go jump on board, that kind of thing. Do you think that's out there?
Oh yeah, I think it's human nature. We all want to look good to our bosses, and so I go back to the mindfulness example. If I'm a safety guy, or if I'm a middle manager, and I could be in HR or I could be in safety, and I go to my boss and I say, there's a number of interesting programs that have come on the market about mindfulness. chances are my boss is going to have read something about mindfulness or have at least heard of the phrase. And she or he is going to say, yeah, I could see that. That's certainly current. That's kind of hot right now. Yeah, bring in somebody to talk to us about mindfulness and how it relates to whether it's safety or other aspects of human relations, talent development, whatever you want to call it. So there is a bit of that fashion mystique, if you want to call it that, to some safety products being trendy, being what's hot right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much. I was just sort of asking. Thomas, hey Thomas, by the way. I don't know if you can see the question on the screen, Dave. What's the influence of politics on safety?
Back up and
Has it
answer
changed
that?
over the years?
Yeah, just to answer that briefly, I think politics has a lot less of an influence on safety in 2022 than it did 30 years ago, certainly than it did 50 years ago.
Easy, Dave. Easy.
Well, just think about it. The OSHA standard setting mill slowed down because a lot of business lobbying groups were created, and you kind of had a political gridlock where, okay, you had people who were pro standards, you had people who were anti-regulatory, and let's cut back on regulations. And I think what has ended up is you've kind of come to a standstill, or you've kind of come to a gridlock between the pro and the anti-regulatory people. And so I don't think you have the influence of politics that you had, in the last century.
We almost have to ask Thomas to sort of be a bit more specific, because I could think of answering that question from a very, 40,000 foot view level, going by making companies responsible for everything in the UK. Like whether you hit the standard, if the guy gets hurt, obviously your standard wasn't good enough. I don't care if it's a government standard; it's your employee. You're still responsible. Like that, there isn't like there is in North America, where as long as I'm legally compliant from a liability point of view, I'm good.
Right.
In England, it's basically if there's an injury, you're not good.
Yeah.
And if they can prove that you didn't do what you needed to do right up at the ownership level, we can take your butt and we can whisk it away somewhere unpleasant. But what happened is a lot of people whisked their companies away to somewhere else, where it wasn't so stringent. So, I think it's a great question, Thomas. It's probably worthwhile a whole show to talk
about. A whole show on that. You could.
Yeah, maybe you and Dave and me, and I could get somebody else on a panel, and we could, certainly somebody from, I was going to say from IOSH or from ROSPA in England, in the UK. I'm never sure what's politically correct. I do know, though, don't go to somebody in Scotland and say it's all the same now, isn't it? You might be listening.
Just one more thing.
You might be listening for a while about that one.
I got to take back a little bit of what I said about politics not weighing in heavily with safety. In some respects, politics still has a very big hand, but it is, instead of making things happen, it's stopping things from happening. Just look at the Supreme Court decision that took away OSHA's ability to mandate vaccinations in workplaces. If you go back, 20 years ago, Congress threw out the ergonomic standard that the Clinton administration had formed. So yes, I got to take some of that back. Politics still plays a role, but I would say it's more of a negative role than a positive role.
There was, for a while, it was very like moving everything in the right direction. It really was. The standards, all of it, you know.
Mhm.
I think it ended with David Michaels leaving, actually. But I think you're right. It can obviously be a big factor. Thomas, thanks so much for the question and also for the idea and the topic. I think it's well worth pursuing or perusing a little bit further on that. Dave, I was gonna get this show done in an hour this time.
We're in overtime, Larry.
Well, but I mean, I know you and we can talk for so long, and
Right.
so many of these things, and there's a few that I'd love to get into in a bit more depth. But basically, the thing that I took away from the one conversation that we had was that there's pressure, supply side economics pressure on the thought leaders
Hmm.
to
Come up with something new. Come up with
yeah, and
something new.
it's not that we don't have new things, but to start demanding 50 new ideas over 20 years might be pushing it, right?
Mhm.
um and like I said, I remember one guy just looking at me saying, I got to keep a roof over my head. And I was just sort of asking, do you have any data on that? And he said, well, yeah, I worked with a plant that had 600 people and these were their results.
Mhm.
I'm like, well, you're making it sound like you had 600 companies with 600 people, So, I think to your point, buyer beware, right?
Yeah.
You can do a bit of due diligence on the data and whatever. A bit of empathy, if I could suggest it to everybody, which is, hey, they're they're coming to you with the best they got,
Yeah.
right? And by and large, they're doing it more
Yeah.
for the cause than for the money. Hopefully, they're making a nickel or two at it so they can keep going, right? But you've got to understand too that it's a bit of the conferences, the magazines. Like the magazines can't publish something old, and the conferences
Right.
can't get anybody to go out if it's same old
Mhm.
stuff. And yet, if you look at the volume that's being demanded, you're going to end up getting some stuff that isn't wheat.
Yeah.
And it's not all because the people are bad folks or charlatans.
No.
It's partially because of the supply side economical, the demand
Pressure.
on the system.
The pressures. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would
And
just real quickly, Larry. I would date myself and go back to the asbestos removal
mhm,
panic rush. And in those days, I remember reporting there were charlatans and there were frauds, and they were called rip and skip artists. And they would rip out asbestos without any safety precautions or any safety equipment. And they were just exploiting the situation and making a quick buck. I don't see that when you're talking about the products that we're talking about for human performance, error reduction, safety management systems, the technology. No, I don't. These are, like you say, these are basically honest people trying to make an honest living and coming out with the products that they can.
yeah,
They're,
I mean,
they're not
you,
frauds.
it's not like I was going to say, there's everybody's entitled to their own opinion. And as you well know, Dave, I don't agree with all of these opinions at all, but, that's, but that's not so much the point. The point is that the system itself is going to produce chaff,
Yep.
and that you've just got to be aware of. And if I could offer, well, your words again, we need to get more safety professionals out to the front lines,
Mhm.
trying to figure it out for themselves so that their perspective is looking at the other guys like this, not, from back at the Pentagon going, show me your stuff, right?
Right.
I need to see, you need to see how this is all working in front of the workers, the rest of the stuff. And you need to kind of get out there yourself before you can really evaluate what the other folks are bringing to the table. I think it's really, it really does, if you can't spend a mile walking in their shoes, at least make sure you get out to the front lines and spend a bit of time out there as well too, because like there's too few, I think, that either have the time or the inclination, like Gary did, to try to get out there and figure it out for himself. But when you do, you start coming to your own conclusions, and then you'll be able to see who's aligned, as opposed to it being a whole analytical affair about their data and so on. It should have some sort of it should resonate intuitively with you too, based on what you've been doing out there, so that you can kind of go, wait a minute, I've talked to a whole bunch of people after they've been hurt, and every one of them said I wasn't thinking about what I was doing at the time when I got hurt. So I'm not going to fix that with rules.
Right.
How am I going to go about fixing that?
Mm-hmm.
And then start looking at what's out there, right? And if you, for instance, heard that 100 out of 100 times from people, I just wasn't thinking about what I was doing, then somebody telling you that the cure for everything is leadership might not resonate with you as much as somebody who says, I think you might want to look into this mindfulness stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not out there at the front line, you could easily become prey to a good salesman or a charlatan.
Being out there on the front line, Larry, one of the things safety pros have told me more than once is the quickest way to learn where the next accident is going to happen is to ask the guys on the front line. They know better than anybody how the work is really being done and where the dangers really are, where the risks really are. And it's
Dave,
a matter of having conversations.
Dave, this was one of my golden questions in the beginning, like in terms of how, like I got where, like past square one, was asking guys, say, tell me, if I gave you $1,000 right now, where would the next serious injury happen here and when? I don't want to know who, because they would pick who before they would pick who before when or where every time. For $1,000 they would actually
give
put
you a name
money if you'd let them pick who. And I thought that was really interesting, considering that there was this whole thing about the hapless innocent worker. Never, I'm going, well, that's funny. I go talk to everybody's coworkers, and they much rather bet on who than where or when. That's interesting. The next part, in terms of where or when, is that you'd find it was a mixture of hazard and complacency.
Mm-hmm.
Like at a sawmill, everybody you ask will tell you planer feeder. Mm-hmm. Next guy you ask, we say planer feeder. Guy working the tail saw, planer feeder. Guy working out in the log yard, planer feeder. So finally, I'm actually talking to the planer feeder, and I'm like, how's it going? He's like, pretty good. Why? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I just talked to 20 people, and they're all willing to bet $1,000 that if anybody was going to get it, you'd be the next one here. So what is up with your job that makes it dangerous, right? And he says, if you forget that your hand's on the board, it gets pulled in so quick that sometimes your hand goes with it underneath the pineapple, and you lose the end of your fingers.
Yeah.
I went, oh. So, there's all kinds of technology now to prevent that, by the way. So not a factor anymore, but, like it was a mixture. It was always a mixture of mind not on task and hazard and complacency.
Right.
Almost always who they'd pick in terms of who was going to get it. And I think, I think that's, if we can end on that, encourage everybody to maybe get out there, get out there yourself, so that your perspective isn't less likely going to be so biased potentially. Like you can hear a good presentation, but it might not actually fix your problems.
I would say take a page from my book as a journalist. Go out on the front lines, ask questions, and then listen, and you're going to learn. You're going to learn a lot.
Yeah, well, you certainly have too, Dave. Okay. Look, we way over time. Thank you so much, everybody, for hanging with us. And Dave, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Larry. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, for taking the time. On March the 8th, same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 a.m. Eastern, we're going to be talking about influence versus control, the power of storytelling with Jack Jackson. I don't know how many of you listening are familiar with Jack Jackson or have heard him speak. He's been keynote speaker at the National Safety Council. He's a phenomenal storyteller. I promise I won't get him to tell any stories that'll have you like having trouble sleeping. He can do that too. But it's March the 8th, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Central. Influence versus control with Jack Jackson, the power of storytelling. Thanks very much, everybody. Dave, thanks again very much to you. And thank you all so much for tuning in, especially those of you in the Philippines. It's got to be real late there by now. So, thanks again, everybody. We'll see you in March.